Hi, my name is Clay Herring, and for my video presentation for child development, I will be discussing the social development theory. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, the social development theory is a very pivotal theory when dealing with child development. It is, along with Piaget, it is one of the more, Piaget's theory is one of the more referred to theories. The social development theory argues that social interaction precedes development, and that consciousness and cognition are the end product of socialization and social behavior. Now, there are going to be three primary factors that we're going to be looking at in regards to social development theory. However, to give further background, we are going to first look at its origins. Okay, so the social development theory was developed by a Russian or Soviet Union psychologist named Lev Vygotsky in the 1930s. It was basically a foundation of constructivism, and it asserted three major themes regarding social interaction: more knowledgeable, and his most famous work, Zone Approximable Development. He was in contrast to Piaget because Vygotsky thought social learning precedes development. To quote him, every function in the child's cultural development appears twice, first on the social level and then on the individual level. So in a sense, first it's between people, and then it comes to an understanding within the individual, and that's really when the zone approximable development comes into play. Now, before we get into the heavier themes of the theory, like the zone approximable development, let's quickly discuss the more knowledgeable individual or other. And that is, the more knowledgeable other is anyone who has a higher ability level of understanding or learning with respect to like a certain task or process or even a concept. So some good examples of this, obviously, your more obvious one would be a parent, coaches with their players, teachers with their students. But these also can be peers, and sometimes even peers that are younger than the subject that is being analyzed. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that basically the major framework of this theory is that the social interaction plays a fundamental role in your cognition development. First, beginning on the individual level, or between people, and then inside. So you're looking at the inner psychological, then the intra psychological. Then this, it basically breaks down that all the higher functions originate as actual relationships between individuals. However, the second aspect of Vygotsky's theory is the idea that your development and cognition depends on this element called the zone approximable development. This is a level where this is basically where the children start to engage in their social behaviors. And this development depends upon full interaction. So the full development of the zone approximable development depends on full social interaction. And the range of skills can be developed with, either adult guidance or maybe even between children and their peers, and so on and so forth. So with this, Vygotsky's theory is basically just trying to attempt to explain that consciousness is the end product of socialization. So take language learning. Our first instances of speech with peers, or our parents or teachers or coaches or whatever you want to call it, just adults in general, are for the purpose of communication. But once this is mastered on a social level, they become internalized, and they can allow inner speech of what we're thinking and feeling. So next we have to talk about how this theory is applied and to child development. And of course, would be found in the school element, even though schools, when you think about it traditionally, it's got what is known as the instructionalist model. So you got a teacher who would lecture, would give students information, and just give students information. So she was a transmitter. However, Vygotsky's theory kind of promotes learning in which there's an active role at play. The role of the teacher and the student is then shifted. So it really becomes a collaboration between a teacher's students. And this helps to facilitate, sort of constructive meaning in the teacher's students. So learning therefore becomes almost more of like it's a reciprocal experience for the students and for the teacher. So with that, let's talk about some examples of application that are they just make it a little bit more clear. Take what we were talking about with the lecture and how it was being transmitted. Instead of a teacher just getting up to the front of the room and putting up a PowerPoint and then just basically reading the PowerPoint, having, I guess the young students just write things down, or just like the teacher doing all of the talking while the children just listen, this would be not a good application of Vygotsky's social development theory. Instead, it would be that the teacher would keep the students engaged, ask them questions, sort of try to tap into any prior knowledge they may have, or tap into something more simplistic that the child can understand, so then the child can answer for themselves, and they would then be socially interacting and learning at the same time. Another example that I've recently kind of grasped that this is why teachers do this is you would have instead of, say, like how you set up your classrooms, instead of rows of desks, you might do a pod system of desks. That way that children are working in group activities. They're not just individualized and just kind of almost just taking in knowledge themselves. They're taking in knowledge the teacher may pass down and then collaborating with one another in order to socially interact and fully understand the concept. So in conclusion to the video on social development theory, we've gone over a lot of things. We've gone over that Vygotsky argued that social interaction precedes development, and that consciousness and cognition are the end product of being socialized and the social behaviors that come with it. We talked about the more knowledgeable other, and how those were coaches and parents, and even sometimes peers that are the same age. We relied heavily on the zone of proximal development, which of course is the process pretty much of them developing their full cognition. Then finally we discussed examples of how during child development these practices can be applied. So we talked about how interactions should be held between teachers and students in the classroom. We talked about ways that you could set up your classroom to achieve a more social atmosphere. And we also briefly discussed the need for group activities, and we were very emphasized heavily on the collaboration between groups of students as well as the teacher. That's really, when applying this theory, that's really the main thing that you need to focus on, because that's the most important element, is making sure that you have this system set up to ignite as much of a social experience as possible. And that is the conclusion of the social development theory video presentation.